In 2009, for the Frieze Art Fair, I was commissioned to do a special project. What I wound up doing was essentially starting a counterfeiting site in the Frieze Art Fair, in which I hired a group of 5 young artists to bootleg and counterfeit other artworks found in other gallery booths. And that production site was set up, directly in front of the viewing audience, so people were able to watch the counterfeiting in action. And then as the objects were finished, they were moved directly into an adjacent gallery space. And then we sold all the works at an incredibly discounted rate. So in a way, we were kind of like the bargain bin of the high-end Frieze Art Fair. And we became a really interesting kind of landing place for people who wanted to, talk about issues of, both art and commodity value and, the kind of frenzy of the art market in a fair context. So, for the period of 5 days, it was an ongoing performative event in which we had to field about 50,000 visitors to the fair and then deal with them on both a conceptual level of discussing our ideas and then also hawking these products that were obviously knockoffs of a really well-known piece just down the way. And try to negotiate with the visitors what their value system was in relationship to what we had to offer. The same curator who curated me into Frieze projects actually worked with me for the PS1 exhibition. And one of the problems was that New York MoMA would not lend PS1 some of their more famous artworks due to either climate control issues or insurance issues. And so they asked me to step in and, in a sense, create proxies for the works. I was given a selection of things and I chose 2 very specific ones that I felt that I had a kind of personal relationship to. Because at the same time, I'm also not a counterfeiter on demand. Like I'd really like to have, a kind of dialogue with these works. So one of the ones I chose was Joseph Beuys's Sled, a very iconic piece. It's a very simple work. It consists of 5 objects grouped together, and that's a wooden German sled, a wool blanket, a hunk of lard, white leather strapping, and a flashlight. So I realized that I could go out and buy these things. It's not really, they're not very hard to find, but that didn't seem to make sense with the project. So I sent out an email and Facebook blast to my extended network of friends to see if they could help me in loaning PS1 a Joseph Beuys piece. And did anyone have a sled, blanket, hunk of lard, etc.? And I was amazed because I got back a kind of torrent of responses. It seemed like everybody had at least one of these things and was willing to contribute. So I had them all directly send the components to PS1, and then I assembled a kind of inventory of them on the floor and then put together a grouping that was the most evocative of the Joseph Beuys work. From there, what was interesting was that people did not realize that it wasn't the real work. And that to me was interesting because the slippage of the real object that has the aura of the Beuys and then this contemporary recreation that's based on a whole different logic structure, which is sort of like the social network to create the new piece. And in a way, I felt that that would hopefully do a Beuys work justice, because I was also trying to bring up his issues of, community involvement and a kind of like social conversation in artwork. And then the second project for the PS1 exhibition, I chose a Robert Morris felt cutout piece, which is again very iconic, and it's something that people can recognize from a distance. But my logic structure was also different in that I had an American moving blanket factory fabricate a Morris in the exact size and shape, and then we actually utilized that moving blanket to ship works from MoMA to PS1. So the install crew actually used it to wrap Richard Serra artworks and Robert Irwin pieces and all sorts of other, real artworks. And then when we got the blanket to PS1, we hung it in the exact shape of the Morris. And so it bore, though, the markings of use, and it bore the kind of labor that went through, the transit route. what was interesting for me was people would come to the exhibition and they would have no idea that it was my work, because for all intents and purposes, it looks like the real thing. So what I liked about that was that, you know, maybe it kind of brought up a little bit of the, I don't know, like a kind of, I don't want to say subversive, but a slightly under the radar level of dialogue, which I think is, you know, still a very kind of rich way of working.